Hello, my name is Gretchen Schnader, and this is my Extreme Makeover project for Nursing 713 at JSU. Here's the table of contents. Here's my learning outcomes. I would like for y'all to relate to a time where you had miscommunication, discuss some themes you felt during miscommunication, compare the patterns of relating and meaning, reflect on miscommunication, and recognize how to prevent miscommunication in the workplace. So my story starts as my first day in the NICU, which I just started about 3 months ago. The person I was orienting with happened to also be the charge nurse. We had two babies that were getting admitted at the same time. Well, around 3 hours difference between each other, but they were called in at the same time to be admitted. One was in the ER currently and was breathing fast, and the other was coming from a different hospital, and they said that the baby was requiring more and more oxygen. The charge nurse delegated the admission of the baby that was coming from a different hospital to these two nurses that were in this large open nursery that we called the critical care nursery, where the sicker or more critical babies usually go. The charge nurse agreed to take the admission that was coming in from the ER because they were needing immediately help. The two nurses said that they were busy at the time, but that they would get to it, and the admission was predicted to arrive 3 hours after those nurses were told that was coming from the other hospital. The charge nurse checked on the nurses 2 hours after delegating that task to them, and the two nurses then said, well, we don't know how to do one of those admissions that are a transfer from another hospital. So the charge nurse handed them this instruction binder and told them that they first needed to call the hospital to get report, get a face sheet faxed over, and get it sent over to our admitting or bed control. The charge nurse then asked those two nurses if they had any questions and then left them to go back to her own admission that she was still finishing up. So then an hour later, the baby arrived from the other hospital, and the two nurses did not get report on the patient. They never got the face sheet, so the patient was not in the computer, and the baby happened to be a lot more critical than we realized. It had no reflexes. It needed to be intubated immediately, and we had to immediately start it on a cooling blanket, but we didn't know any of these things because we didn't get report or anything. So how this miscommunication occurred. The patient was not thought to be as critical as he was. We had no idea. We just thought maybe we had to put a CPAP on him. We did not know we were going to have to intubate, and we just were not sure what we were getting right when he arrived, I guess. We thought he was not as sick, but then he turned out to be pretty sick. So if we would have known, we would have had the supplies ready, the intubation supplies, the cooling therapy supplies, and the ventilator ready. But also, if these nurses had spoken up previously and said that they did not have time or they did not know how, another nurse could have stepped in and handled things or could have showed them how to do the admission. And those two nurses, they did happen to be new graduates. They'd only worked on the unit, I think, around 3 to 6 months, each of them, and they should have known to ask for help. But I know sometimes when you're new, you kind of are nervous to ask questions. And the charge nurse really probably should have only dedicated the task to one nurse, because sometimes when you delegate a task to two people, one of them might think the other's doing it, and then turns out both of them are not doing the task. So some conversational things about miscommunication. These words should stand out. Frustration, confusion, inadequacy, stressed, overwhelmed. These are some feelings that we do feel as nurses sometimes and can lead to miscommunication. So the charge nurse was getting multiple admissions at once. There was two admissions they were called about within 5 minutes of each other. So that was frustration by the charge nurse because she didn't have an extra nurse, and we had to kind of give nurses extra patients and take on extra patients ourselves because I was with her. The nurses did not know how to do an admission, and sometimes we do get confused and feel inadequate as nurses because we're scared to tell people that, oh, we don't know what we're doing. So that can be really frustrating. So then the patient arrives and there's not been any report. We don't know what we're getting, and there's no equipment that's been set up to, prepare. So that's stressed by a lot of the nurses felt on the unit because then the patient arrived and we had to ask for all the nurses really to come help and assist with this because we had to get the cooling therapy, get the intubation. We had to place some central lines real quick, and it was just like very overwhelming for the rest of the nurses because of what happened with the miscommunication. So, the nurses need to know their organization's missions and values and reflect on what that means to them. Thinking about how this can influence the way you work as a nurse. The organization gives you their chain of command, and instead of going to the topmost person of the hospital, like the CEO, nurses can go to their charge nurses. If they need more assistance, they can always go to the nurse managers and then up to the departmental manager. This is based on my unit or where I work. And so this way is going through the chain of command, and that way you get your answers faster. And if everyone went directly to the CEO of an organization, he would or she would not have time to help every single person. So it is good to have that chain of command. And you see the same people you work with every time you come to work. So it's important to create a relationship with them. So if you can relate to your peers and your leaders, you're more likely to develop a culture of trust and connection. They can help you just like you'll help them. If you see someone who needs help, you can help them. If they see you need help, they'll come help you. And that's what we want. If there's a lack of communication or miscommunication between the nurses and their peers and their leaders, this can create an environment of mistrust, frustration, confusion, and stress, which is things we do not want in the nursing environment. So with patterns of relating, this is kind of how we interact as nurses to each other in the workplace, between the nursing assistants, the secretaries, and the charge nurses. And we need to all relate to another because we're all working together in the same setting as a group, and it could be a hospital setting where I work, a clinic setting, or really an office setting. But how we relate forms the organization culture. If a charge nurse leads by relational leadership or the departmental lead or anyone that's a leader in your organization, it's important that they're collaborating and empowering and sharing and talking to everyone for continuously learning and developing relationships with each other. When you use my miscommunication example, the charge nurse should have been leading with a relational leading environment to make sure that even though the admission process was stressful, we all felt like a team. By not placing blame on those nurses who weren't prepared and didn't know what to do, but we really need to instead work with them to help take care of the patient because patient care is the ultimate goal, and make sure that everyone's learning from this situation. With patterns of meaning, my organizational's mission statement is to provide quality healthcare with kindness and clinical excellence, personalized through compassion and faith. And also, the value of my organization is our values will reflect our commitment and will be demonstrated by our actions. So we need to think about our organization's mission, vision, value, and kind of reflect on that on what it means for us. While there is miscommunication in the workplace, all nurses need to hold up their organization mission statement to provide quality healthcare. And for us, it's with kindness and demonstration by our actions. The charge nurse did not blame the nurses, but she did respond in a way that was kind because she did help them and assisted them as best she tried to, I think, in the situation. But reflecting back, I think there is more that she could have done. And she did help the nurses with the admission once the patient arrived, but hopefully we learn from this situation and we will do the admission process before the patient arrives and get prepared for it. And showing the nurses where to find resources the next time they have this problem occur. It's crazy to think that how every time we open our mouth, it changes the way someone sees us or how we're reflected on for our organization or even nursing as a whole, because we're a representation of like nursing in our organization. So what we say matters. We need to think about these things before we speak and try to use our words to positively affect others. When we listen to others, we're showing that we care what they have to say and that we respect them as a person. This could be when a new nurse asks a question or a family member of a patient has something to say that they want to talk about their experience, or a patient is telling the nurse how they're feeling. When we're listening, we're creating meaning and connecting with them. We also need to listen to nonverbal communication. So when miscommunication took place, for my example, the nurses were not really giving their full attention to the charge nurse when she was telling them about their admission that was coming from the other hospital. They were kind of doing things, kind of busy helping these little babies in the NICU, but this could have been a clue to the charge nurse that she needed to reiterate what she was saying to make sure the nurses understood, like, you have an admission coming soon, and make sure they were listening and understanding, and instead of seeing that they were kind of running around and a little busy when she told them. So being present and being aware. As nurses, we want our patients to be informed and cared for when we talk about them and talk to them and let them feel heard when we listen to them. So reflecting on what happened during my miscommunication example, these nurses were kind of new graduates right out of nursing school, and they didn't know everything once they started working. So it takes some years to gain experience, and every shift you work is a time to learn. Because of the nursing shortage that's going on all over, a lot of nurses have left the bedside. So where I work, the charge nurse is supposed to be designated the person that has the most experience, and at that time, the person who was orienting me was the person who'd been there a year and had the most experience out of all 8 of us nurses that were there. And it's hard being the leader of new graduates when you're still kind of a new nurse yourself. I think she had a lot of stress on her as being the charge nurse and being new herself, and she had not been a charge nurse long. But as a charge nurse, you need to think about how to best communicate and have meaningful conversations. In the TED Talk by Celeste Headley, she explains that a lot of people don't know how to have a conversation with other people, and being able to have a conversation is very important, especially for people in leadership positions, such as the charge nurse, orienting the people and, leading others by example. And so some of the things that Headley goes over is that when you have a conversation, you need to tell someone when you don't know something, but also don't assume that everyone has the same experiences that you have. And this is important because the charge nurse just assumed that these nurses knew how to do an admission when in fact they did not. So we don't usually admit or discharge on night shift, but these nurses definitely did not know that. So it was important for the charge nurse not to know that. She could have asked questions and then they would have found out that they didn't know what they were doing. So with my extreme makeover, I would say that this is what should have happened. So it was my first day as a nurse on the NICU. The charge nurse was not the person orienting me. We should have had some adequate staffing. There were 2 babies getting admitted. One was in the ER. The other was coming from a different hospital. The charge nurse delegated one of those admissions to the nurse, just one of them, not 2 nurses, where the critical babies go, and the charge nurse agreed to take the admission that was in the ER. The nurse communicated to the charge nurse that she was unsure how to do an admission for a patient transferring from another hospital. And so the admission was predicted to arrive around 3 hours, and the charge nurse sat down with that nurse, showed her where the resources were on how to do an admission, and then explained to her what to do for the admission, which is to call report, get the face sheet, fax it over. So the nurse was able to get all those things after she got called up and then got someone to watch her patients. And so then when the charge nurse checked on her 2 hours later, the nurse had stated she had done everything to get ready except for get supplies, and the charge nurse was able to help her get those supplies. So then when the patient arrived, we were able to immediately put him on cooling therapy, immediately intubate, and the patient was in the computer system. So the best way to change this story would to have adequate staffing, make sure the charge nurse was not new. The charge nurse was able to delegate to just 1 nurse, not 2, and they were able to ask for help. That way the patient's admission would go smoothly. But I think it's important that everyone talked this through after this happened and learned from this experience. They really did, and they talked to the charge nurse the next day, and everyone learned from this. Thank you so much for listening to my Miscommunication Extreme Makeover assignment.